Oh, hey,
Hey,
don't have to wait any longer.
no waiting, no waiting. Calling Chris Anderson in the land of new bookcases, London.
That's right.
Sorry, that was the last thing we were talking about. It's in my head.
Chris Anderson led a Hollywood fire in Chicago.
Roger Wilco over Read You 5x5. How you doing, Chris?
What did you smoke before the show?
Oh, what was he smoking? I don't know. I'm very excited that a week from now we're going to be together, reunited, hanging out.
Where are we going to be?
Let's see, a week from today, are we going to be on the ferry from England to Normandy, or is that a week from yesterday? I don't know.
Something like that. But actually, a week from Friday, we're going to be at my pub, which is the important.
Yes, that's the very important
which is the
part.
coolest local pub in London.
It's an unordinary ordinary.
Exactly.
Right? So
I like that. That was good.
Thank you. We want to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, although who knows why when we're acting like this. And Chris and I may travel the globe. We may even wind up together in London, but we still manage to be here Sundays to have a cocktail and talk some history with you guys. And today we'll be talking about a remarkable attack on America in the years preceding our entry into World War One. But before we get to that, Chris, who have we got? Is anybody watching?
Well, actually, believe it or not, they are. They came
Wow.
back.
Wow.
Ted Moon's back. Frank Cook from Attleboro.
Look, George is here from the beginning of the show.
I
Very
know.
rare. I know, that's good, George.
And Xavier, so we have our international contingent.
Well, and don't forget John from Toronto, Jim Latin from Palo Alto or wherever he is out there. And Lizzie Borden is here, and all sorts of good people. So that's fantastic. And I want to just take a moment, Chris, to say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf Patreon supporters. There's 2 new names on there this week, Chris. So even though it's even, it's now,
the font's getting smaller.
The font is getting smaller. So, but there is more room. Believe me, our design team has been at it, extra hours, working on how they can fit more names on there. So if you want to support us via Patreon at any level, but here at the top shelf level, patreon.com/History Happy Hour. Okay, I've gotten all that stuff out of the way. Mr. Anderson, help me out. Let's get to the open, for heaven's sake, and get to the show. The bar is open, and apparently it's been open for a while. After the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, German sabotage agents set out to destroy neutral America's war-making abilities by unleashing a campaign of terror and destruction on our shores. And the scale of this campaign was truly extraordinary. And equally extraordinary to me is the fact that it's barely remembered at all. Hardly anybody knows that this ever happened. Well, our guest today, Mike Digby, has set out to rediscover this story. And Mike is a former U.S. Army soldier and a retired disposal officer for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. So he's a retired bomb disposal officer.
I was going to say, that sounds a little
not
better
a disposal officer, a bomb disposal officer. He's written a new book called Burn, Bomb, Destroy, the German Sabotage Campaign in North America. And I think this is his first history book. And I want to welcome Mike to the show. Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Very welcome. Nice to be here.
And Mike actually told us he's been watching the show for a few weeks, even before we asked him to be on it. So that's why we're very relaxed today, because he already knows. He already knows. So we can't really make a good impression now. It's too late, right?
That's right.
Mike, your background, as mentioned, is as a bomb guy. 34 years on the bomb squad. Still now, although I think you said it was 6 hours after you retired that you went back and started consulting and training and doing all sorts of stuff. So obviously that's kind of your point of entry of interest on the story. But what led you to focus on this particular story?
On this particular story, well, as the training guy for my unit and having an interest in explosives and terrorist acts, I was already researching some 1950s and 1960s bombings. As I said before, I'm kind of a bomb nerd, and
We all have to have
and
a thing.
right, it's a
Right.
niche for
Everybody's got to have something, and we're glad you have something to keep you busy.
yeah, it's certainly a niche. But I kept getting references to, or kept seeing references to cigar bombs. And I would go back another decade and I'd see even more references to cigar bombs. And looking at some of the schematics, it seemed like they were all of one design. And then in World War II, I was also noticing that the US, British militaries were using a device that they even nicknamed the cigar bomb. So, being curious, I went all the way back as far as I could until I found mention of a man named Dr. Walter Scheel. He was a German sleeper agent living and working in New York City in the early 1900s. And it was his design. And he designed it in a warehouse, a former chocolate factory in Hoboken, New Jersey. And it was his design that was the first of the German incendiary devices used to target warehouses and factories, munitions plants, and especially ships. So that's where my interest kind of started in this campaign, one of which I had never heard of before.
Well, that kind of leads very nicely to my first question, Mike. It's, we were talking before the show. We both have an interest in the special operations executive. I know from living here in London, you know from your own interests, there is no shortage of books and movies and documentaries about spies and espionage and all this sort of stuff in World War II. But
Right.
nobody's heard about this during the First World War. Why do you think there's this omission between the two? I mean, as you point out in the book, clearly things were going on in World War One. So
Yeah, I don't know. I do know that in the last decade, there have been some books written about the campaign. Great books, actually. Uh, but those books all tended to focus on one player or one event or one place in the country where these were taking place. My interest is on the bombs.
all right.
And although I thought this was going to take me on a path of cigar bomb, cigar bomb, cigar bomb, and kind of end with a just having my fascination answered, it actually led into the design of other bombs, uh, rudder bombs to be placed on the outside of ships, uh, thermite bombs to be placed inside munitions plants and factories. So it was the design of the bombs that kept my curiosity about this campaign. And of course, those bombs are being built by people with limited background in explosive designs. So there's lots of failures, there's some successes, and I wanted to see how I could work that into a story for the guys working in my unit. Again, I was never planning on writing a book about it. There were plenty of books already. But the more I looked into it, the more the guys in my unit said, hey, why don't you write about it? And that's what I did.
So I think, and I want to talk a little bit about the context that this is happening in, war has been declared in Europe in August 1914, but the U.S. is not involved, and we are supposedly neutral. But it probably doesn't look like neutrality from the point of view of the Germans, because we're supplying the British and the Russians, who are both fighting Germany. We are pretty cozy with Britain. So it's kind of a situation, I guess, in which Germany feels that they kind of have to do something. Is that a reasonable way of expressing it?
Sure. The man who actually masterminded this in Berlin, he was constantly sending messages back to New York, emphasizing the need to curtail these shipments of munitions and horses and mules and war supplies. And he was, his name was Walter Nicolai. He was increasingly frustrated over the inability of his four subordinates to get things done. And for the first 6 months, this was truly a using a gang that couldn't shoot straight. The Germans that were here in America had no cohesiveness. It was hard to get things done, and of course that resulted in some very poor decision making on their part.
But so about Mike, I mean, could you just so we have a sense of, I guess, the operation before we get into the details of it? How high up in the German government is this being managed from? And maybe you could talk a little bit about Abteilung 3B, what that is, and how this is all organized. Is it just one-offs, people in America, or is this an organized campaign? And if so, kind of who's organizing it or calling the shots?
Good question. Boy, this is certainly not an ad hoc group in the United States who just decided to wage war on America. This was a decision made at the highest levels of the German government. Mm-hmm. And it required a whole of government approach to managing this secret war. It required a well-funded network of scientists, saboteurs, spies, and sleeper agents. And all of them had to be aided by complicit diplomats, compromised journalists, volunteer couriers, and just volunteers in every aspect. But they were aided by thousands of German military reservists that were living in Central America and in North America, whom they felt they could draw upon to serve as saboteurs in the United States. But now you asked about 3B. The German General Staff relied heavily upon the intelligence services. And within the German intelligence service was a section called 3B, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Nicolai. And he was a true student of information gathering and using intelligence as a combat tool. He had spent at least 2 years, probably more, but at least 2 years, studying the detection capabilities of foreign intelligence agencies, as well as detective bureaus, and then looking at the illegal activities of terrorist networks, anarchist gangs, criminal groups, and from them he developed an interest in the cloak and dagger way of irregular warfare. He set his sights on America and determined that he could keep munitions and war supplies from being delivered to the Allies if I could put his secret army to work in North America. And it was a great plan.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the people who were some of the main characters in this story. Maybe we can start with the German ambassador to the United States and his right-hand man on this, who's certainly one of my favorite figures in this story, and is a sort of a very strange figure, I think, in history. Fritz von Papen, who's going to go on to some notoriety of various
definitely
types.
A Yankees fan.
During definitely evil empire
yeah.
territory, yeah. So, but talk about those and maybe some of the other kind of key characters here.
Sure. It's like a rogue gallery of incompetent fools, honestly.
But listen, say what you think, okay? Because don't hold back.
But having said that, later on they cleaned up and they got a lot better at it. But at first, their starting lineup was anything but competent. There was Ambassador Johann von Bernsdorf, and he worked at the embassy on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. He was a playboy. He was a darling of the social scene. He was constantly in American newspapers, 1913 and 1914, showing him vacationing with his wife, with his girlfriends, traveling with entourages.
Was he vacationing with his wife and girlfriends on the same trip, or were those different trips?
Different trips.
That's a separate ship.
Yeah. He'd visit the Catskills and would have the paparazzi on him, interviewing him for 1,000 different things. So everybody knew who Ambassador von Bernsdorf was. And his American wife was an actress based out of New York. And he got the call in July of 1914 to come back to Berlin, which to him, of course, was no big deal. He goes there for what he thinks is a meeting, and instead he's escorted over to the offices of Walter Nicolai at 3B and told that he will now head a network of spies and saboteurs to set fire to the United States. And it's not something he probably wanted to hear.
But okay, did you guys?
No, go ahead. Go ahead,
No,
Chris.
what we're talking about here, though, basically before we're at the war, and I know we're dancing on the edge of neutrality, but officially we're still neutral, but Germany is actually conducting acts of war against us, right?
Yes, and Nikolai made it clear to everybody that he spoke, starting with von Bernsdorf, and later some of the spies that he personally sent to North America. He made it clear to them, he emphasized to them the need to keep Germany and Germans' name out of any of these activities. Nothing could be linked back to the Germans.
Right.
And as you'll see, anyone that reads the book will see that lasted no more than a month.
I was going to say, yeah.
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 It was the worst kept secret in North America.
Well, and maybe that's because of another one of the band of incompetents. Talk to us a little bit about Fritz von Papen, seen here in that ever popular German uniform with
snappy
the
dresser.
with the spike on the helmet. Tell us a little bit about what his story is at this time in the early days, 1914, 1915.
Sure. Franz von Papen is the military
Franz von
attaché
Papen.
from Germany to North America. And he spends a considerable amount of his time in Mexico watching war exercises, talking to Mexican field commanders. And part of his job, not the main job, but part of his job is to present Germany as a friend to Mexico and to make contact with the Mexicans in order to secure some of the oil fields in Mexico. And in July 1914, Walter Nicolai sends him a message in Mexico asking him to do some research on the manner in which railroads are being targeted with explosives. And this is clearly well beyond von Papen's expertise, but it doesn't keep him from writing up a document explaining the fact that the Mexican insurgents are using dynamite to blow up rail lines. And he forwards it back to Nicolai, and Nicolai sends him a message telling him to get to Washington, D.C. and speak to von Bernsdorf because von Bernsdorf has a job for him. Also on von Papen, before I move on,
Sure.
Von Papen, his job is to take charge of all the sabotage operations in America, just blanketly. And as you'll see, and anyone who reads will see, is that quickly morphs into other projects as well that draws his attention away just from committing acts of sabotage.
So like one of the things I think that, again, you kind of spell it really well in the book that I found very fascinating is they're starting from pretty much nothing, right?
Right.
Not only in terms of personnel but in terms of technology, and then pretty quickly they ramp up into a serious campaign of espionage and what have you. Could you just maybe talk a bit about kind of in terms of the armament, since that's an area that you're particularly interested in? What are the first things they're using to try to get this thing to go, and how does that evolve? What advances do they make in that technological sphere?
Sure. They originally start using dynamite. And dynamite to them is easy to procure because they have a sleeper agent named Hans Taucher working for the Krupp organization it's either New York State or New Jersey. I think it's New Jersey. And through the Krupp organization, they can obtain all the dynamite they need. So von Papen knows that by working with Taucher, uh, all of his sabotage activity will be done with time fuse, dynamites, and generators. That's it. And as anyone in the field of explosives knows, that when you're using time fuse or you're using generators, that's probably not the best way to commit sabotage. You need lots of dynamite, you need long lengths of time fuse, and so on. But that kind of shows the amateurishness of von Papen. So in the early days, it's dynamite that ends up uh, moving into these cigar bombs. Very easy to conceal, but they had a lot of misfires. And then they started developing these other longer cigars that, although they also had malfunctions and misfires, they were in the development stage of another device called the glass. And of course, it's made of glass in the shape of a cigar. And just by tipping off or breaking off the tip of it, you can have an immediate flash of fire. So if it's placed amongst combustibles, you can have a very big fire. And then they started using time delay dynamite bombs uh, and so on. But that was later on. It took a good year for them to figure this out.
Could you, I mean, maybe describe a little bit more, since I know this is one of the things that sparked your interest. I don't want to sound sarcastic, but when you say cigar bomb, before I read the book, I was thinking of the Three Stooges in a vaudeville stick. What exactly is a cigar bomb? How does it work? What is it?
Sure, they were 3 inches, 7 inches, and 11-inch lengths of cylindrical tube in the shape of a cigar. Within that metal pipe, which was completely improvised, of course, are 2 cavities, and each of those cavities had chemicals in it, which, when they mixed, would create a very big flash of fire. Now, the lengths of these pipes, 3, 7, and 11 inches, were all variants as to time delay. For instance, a 3-inch cigar might have an hour delay, 2-hour delay. A 7-inch might have a 1 or 2 day delay, whereas an 11-inch would have a 3 to 7 day delay. And of course, those would be used to set fires on ships.
And correct me if I'm wrong, though, but this is technology that hadn't existed before the Germans decide they're going to launch this campaign. Like there haven't been cigar bombs used somewhere else. This is something they developed for this specific campaign.
Right, and I looked. I went as far back as I could. No references to cigar bombs, and certainly nothing that looked the same or was built the same. And of course, what's interesting about the cigar bomb is it's built in an old chocolate factory. Hundreds of them. I'm sorry, dozens of them. And because production needed to start making hundreds of these at a time, the production of these cigar bombs was moved to an idled German ship in Hoboken, the Friedrich de Gross. And aboard ship, there were anywhere up to 6 or 7 sailors who had nothing to do, of course, because the ships are idled, German sailors. And in the machine shops aboard ship, which are out of the prying eyes of the public, these guys are turning over up to 500 or 700 of these cigar bombs.
That's crazy.
Wow. And I've been told that that this device, I mean, you talked about going backwards, right? So you talked about kind of going backwards and discovering this. But if you think about the opposite, going forwards, it was revolutionary enough and technologically advanced enough that it led to the British picking it up, as you discussed, as something in World War II. And also, so I've been told the OSS also developing variations on that, where they changed it was acid burning through copper, right, on the timer on the cigar bomb, that the OSS changed it to acetone or different substances inside the cigar bomb, but with the same idea of how it works. So it's a piece of technology that has been improved, but was revolutionary enough to be really important.
Absolutely. And
Um,
even in my lifetime, within the last 10 years of my service in the bomb squad, we had a teenager making cigar bombs. He called them pencil bombs, but cigar bombs at a local high school here in Los Angeles.
wow,
Now, that's not exactly why I got started on this project, but I did come back to it later.
it just kind of get you into it. Um,
Mhm.
I want to talk about some of the early efforts. You said that these guys are not particularly competent in the early going, and one of the early efforts that you talk about is actually um, it's a bridge, the Vanceboro Bridge, and this is going to be good for Chris because it involves Canada.
Who? Oh,
Uh,
sorry.
and he's paying
Sure.
attention again, and but it's kind of one of the very first attempts. And Canada's important, obviously, because they are part of the British Empire. They are trying to supply Britain as well, and some of that stuff could be coming across this bridge into the United States. So, talk to us about this early attempt and kind of what goes wrong there.
Sure. Of the hundreds of reservists that are showing up at the so-called War Intelligence Center in New York, manned by von Papen, of the many reservists, one of them is a man named Werner Horn. He's a retired German army reservist. He had served in the artillery, I think it was artillery, and had been running a coffee plantation in Central America. And when he got his mobilization orders to return to Germany, he, of course, stopped in New York, checked in at the German consulate, and they referred him to the War Intelligence Center, where he was interviewed by von Papen and Carl, or boy Ed, both of whom were two of the four members of the Secret War Council. And information had gotten to von Papen through his many sources that supplies headed to Europe on ships leaving out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, were coming on train from Michigan into Ontario, through Quebec, New Brunswick, and then traversing Maine, which was not in keeping with neutrality matters. So yeah,
Neutrality is
I know. So it was basically a shortcut. So so von Papen and Nikolai and boy Ed all came up with a plan of targeting the railway bridge between or linking Vanceboro, Maine with St. Croix, New Brunswick. It's a short bridge. It's not very long, only a few hundred feet long. In fact, that's the bridge in its entirety. And in January of 1915, after 3 weeks of training, and I'm using italics for training,
Got that.
training that took place at the German club over a beer, Werner Horn was filled with propaganda given to him by von Papen that the Canadians are torturing German prisoners in the Arctic, that Canadians are developing a weapon that's particularly nasty called the Dum Dum bullet, and that the Canadians are committing atrocities or are about to commit atrocities in Europe. So the idea was to get Werner Horn pumped up to commit an act of sabotage. Well, that act of sabotage involved 60 sticks of dynamite and long lengths of coiled time fuse, and a cigar. And he was given train tickets from New York to Boston to Bangor, Maine, and eventually to Vanceboro, Maine. And he arrived there late in January 1915.
Can I just say one thing that
Sure.
to interrupt, not to interrupt, but as I said the other day, I'm helping. This is me helping. That I love this. He's in disguise, so he's dressed in workman's clothes.
Yeah.
And then they give him a first class ticket, so he's in the first class compartment, and no one can figure out. Well, he's suspicious right from the get go.
Right. And when BI agents later went back to investigate his movements from Vanceboro all the way back to wherever he came from, it turns out Werner Horn was memorable to everybody because of the nasty clothes he was wearing. because of the fact that he walked like a German soldier. His haircut was short blonde, and he looked like he was tall and in shape. So there was no hiding him on board that train. Everybody knew that he doesn't belong here. They just didn't know he was a sabotage agent.
He's a strange guy that shows up in Vanceboro, Maine, in the middle of the night with no reason at all. That would
Right. And as I wrote, the guy nearly froze to death that first night. He decided he wasn't going to do the bombing the first night. He goes to the hotel, plans on it the second night, and it's equally as cold, if not colder. His hands can't move quite as well, so it's hard for him to recover the dynamite that's in the luggage, to pull it out, to bind it together, and to attach it to the bridge. And as he's doing that, despite the fact that he's given a timetable from von Papen, there are trains that are coming and going over that bridge that don't appear on that timetable, and it basically scares him to death. Because what he doesn't want to do is he does not want to kill anybody. So A, he's happy that the bridge is nowhere near houses, and B, he thinks he can blow this bridge without causing a loss of life. So as he's setting the charge for the first time, a train comes barreling towards him. He takes cover on the Canadian side, which is not where he wants to be, because he's convinced that if he's taken captive, he'll be executed on the spot.
And tortured by those torturing Canadians.
Right.
Obviously, yeah. But that we heard about. I mean, so, yeah. Okay.
So he brushes himself off, and he makes a second attempt. And the same thing happens. Another train comes. So he runs back to the American side, takes cover, and barely avoids getting struck by the train. Now that he cannot trust the timetable and never wanting to hurt anybody, he decides to cut the time fuse down from an hour to just a few minutes. And that's particularly dangerous for him because he needs that time to get away before the explosion. So he cuts the time fuse, places the charge, lights the fuse, gets back onto the American side, and luckily for him, the explosion occurs. But because he was so cold and his hands didn't work as well, he wasn't able to put it on the bridge in an area that would create the most damage. In fact, he put it in an area that would cause the least amount of damage, but just the least amount. So because he's frozen half to death, he goes back to the same hotel that he had vacated earlier that night, and with hands that are practically frozen, he asks for a room. The owner of the hotel, Aubrey Tague, takes him up to a bathroom where he's able to clean his hands up, put some first aid on his hands, and actually put him to bed in an unused bedroom. And it's not until the next morning that it gets reported to the Canadian Railroad Police, to the constables in New Brunswick, and then, of course, to the one sheriff's deputy in the town of Vanceboro. And that's him on the right. His name is George Ross. He's the deputy sheriff. And in this photograph, he is handcuffed to Werner Horn. And if you were able to look at the photograph even clearer, you could see that Werner's hands are puffy, they're swollen, and there's skin missing from his right index finger. And that's all, of course, because of the, I'll call it frostbite. I'm not sure it was, but the cold injuries that he had. What I found of interest is Ross slept through the explosion. It's not of any concern to him. It woke up everybody else in town, and it frightened them half to death. But everyone was concerned, but apparently George Ross was not so much. It wasn't until the next morning that the Canadian police knocked on George's door and said, "Hey, we've got word that there's a man with a German accent, a suspicious man, at the hotel in Vanceboro. We need to go talk to him." So George Ross got dressed. They made the approach to the hotel and detained Werner Horn in bed and in his clothing they found small German flags and a pistol and other items. And the reason for the German flags, which I thought of interest, was in one of the discussions at the hotel in New York, at the bar in New York, von Papen said, if you have these flags pinned to your arms, you might be able to convince Canadian authorities that you're in a uniform and therefore aren't subject to execution as a spy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I bet that would have gone down really well.
Probably
That
not.
That would have worked perfect.
Right.
But
So Werner Horn became the first arrestee in this campaign. He was interviewed by a Bureau of Investigation agent who agreed that this is the vanguard of a campaign of bombings that we should expect. The bad thing is that information did not get filtered out to any law enforcement agencies around the country. It kind of stayed not just within the Bureau of Investigation, but within his own office, and I can't account for that. Meanwhile, New York police, the Secret Service, and other police agencies are unaware that a campaign is about to hit.
so that actually kind of leads into another question I had. So, from pretty humble beginnings, this ramps up into a very, very serious effort. In fact, as I read the book, I was shocked at how serious it was. From this guy at this bridge in Maine to, manufacturing hundreds of these cigar bombs covertly. I mean, that's a major effort. So, in conjunction with what the Germans are doing, how does American law enforcement evolve as this threat develops? Because you said at the beginning, it doesn't get out at all. But how do they? What's the progression of their response, and how are then we able to respond to this? How seriously, do they begin to take it?
Good. The best way to explain it is to talk about the Robert Fay case, Fay. In April of 1915, Robert Fay came to America as a bomb builder. He'd been sent by Walter Nicolai after having been in the trenches in France as a combat engineer. So he comes to New York, and with his brother, who is the man in this photograph to the right, Robert Fay is on the left, they develop a bomb building factory that they called the Riverside Garage, and this is in Weehawken, New Jersey. And their plan is to build big bombs to be placed on the outside of ships. Okay, so hold that part of the story. About 3 months into their bomb building endeavors, word starts leaking out, and it gets heard by the French military attaché in New York. And his name is Robert Martin, he contacts Lieutenant Tom Tunney of the New York Police Department's bomb squad in New York, and says, I've got this interesting caper where I'm being asked to purchase chemicals for someone who's been experimenting with dynamite, and I don't know what the purpose of it is, but because all these ships going to Europe are being bombed and set on fire, I don't want to be a party to this. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lieutenant Tunney, and you investigate it any way you seem fit. Okay, so Lieutenant Tunney puts together a very quick surveillance team, all of the members of his team, so there's 8 of them total. And they decide that they're going to do a controlled delivery of these chemicals from a place in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, to the subject of Captain Martin's information. And basically, it's Lieutenant Tunney is trying to do something, anything, to get out in front of all these fires and explosions. So when he hears about this caper, he commits all of his resources, all 8 guys. They do a surveillance. They bed down the dynamite and the chemicals to Weehawken, New Jersey, and I'm leaving a lot of it out, but they were able to isolate this one person whom they arrest. That person says, oh, it's Robert Fay. He's building bombs to blow up ships, which is exactly what Lieutenant Tunney wants to hear. But now this is 36 hours into a round-the-clock surveillance operation involving NYPD. And Lieutenant Tunney can't sustain this. He just can't. So he has to reach out to other agencies, the Secret Service, the Bureau of Investigation, the Hoboken Police Department. And when he does that, the United States Department of Justice goes livid. They can't understand why he would start an investigation not involving all of the agencies that are chasing these German saboteurs. So, to everyone's credit, for the next 48 hours, all these teams come together and they make up to 12 arrests, and they knock the Robert Fay case right out of the water. They seize dynamite, chemicals, everything they need. But Lieutenant Tunney realizes that none of these devices have anything to do with the cigar bombs that are blowing up munitions factories and ships. This is an altogether different network. But what that does, and to get to your answer, what this does now is it convinces all of the law enforcement agencies that they need to start working together. They need to cooperate. They need to share information. And this is where, for about the first time, Lieutenant Tunney hears about the Sborough Bridge bombing. This is where information is first coming out about all these ship fires and explosions. And it must have been the kind of meeting that I would have enjoyed listening to. But this is where they decide from now on, we're going to go out in integrated teams. So ship fires are being investigated by NYPD, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Investigation, all together, not independently, but together. So I credit that case as the start of the cooperation, October of 1915.
So the Germans are getting better, and law enforcement slowly gets better. And this is probably a pattern that's been repeated ad infinitum in history. Each side improves and gets a little bit smarter. I was in the great state of New Jersey yesterday, and Chris, I was there to honor a Ghost Army veteran. Okay. And so, and I drove through New Jersey, and a lot of this story, even though there's bombings and acts of sabotage coast to coast, a lot of this story happens in New Jersey. And in fact, two of the very biggest bombings that were part of this campaign, the Black Tom bombing and the Kingsland bombing, which are among the biggest non-nuclear explosions ever to take place in the United States, neither of which I'd heard of until, I think, Black Tom a couple of years ago and Kingsland, from your book. Talk to us a little bit about these huge explosions. What happens there, and does that finally wake everybody up to say, hey, we got a huge problem here, or not?
Yes and yes. So,
okay, are we done?
Yeah.
We go on to Chris's question.
So, with law enforcement working together starting in October 1915, right through Christmas, there's a lot of trade-off of investigations, so that guys can commit all of their resources towards following what they believe to be the shot callers, the persons worthy of investigation, not just the low-level people. So Berlin, Walter Nicolai, realized that his sabotage campaign was in total disarray. The cigar bombs weren't being built anymore. The Robert Fay group was totally dismantled, and other cases fell apart as well. So he brought back to Berlin three of the strangest collection, the strangest collection of saboteurs you could imagine. One of them is a 19-year-old New Jersey high school student, and that's his claim to experience. The second is a man named Anton Dilger, who is the son of a Civil War, American Civil War Medal of Honor winner named Hubert Dilger. And the third person is a administrative nerd named Paul Hilken. And the three of these men were chosen by Nicolai to come back to America and commence bombings of every munitions plant and war factory in the United States. Compile a list and go after them one by one. And I will start sending you the agents directly from Berlin. We're not going to rely on any volunteer saboteurs anymore. We're going to send you trained people with explosives designed here in our laboratories in Germany. So the Black Tom Island disaster, July of 1916, was a massive explosion. Massive. Yeah, there you go. And in the book, I talk about how it impacted Manhattan, Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty, which still has damage from the explosion on the statue itself and on the pedestal.
And it was right
How,
near where Liberty Park is right now, right on the Jersey side.
yes, yes. And it flattened the area around Black Tom Island. And this was really only carried out by 3 sabotage agents, 2 of whom were very experienced, and one of whom, just because I know how these things work, one of whom was probably intended to be the patsy, so that if they had to give up somebody, it was going to be this patsy, easy guy to blame it on, and these 2 sabotage agents could flee to Mexico and get away from things. But it was a massive explosion. Because of the success of that explosion, coupled with the ground zero explosions of munitions plants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I mean, dozens to multiple dozens of munitions plants throughout 1916, it convinced Nikolai that he was on the right track. So he started sending more agents over with more munitions and more explosive devices. And he had his team, which he called the Hoboken Bunch, which is the 19-year-old high school kid, Hilken and Dilger. He had them as the coordinators. So they chose the targets. The sabotage agents would come in with their explosives and go to work. Kingsland, the Kingsland Assembly Plant in New Jersey, was just one more example of a location that was always on the Germans' target list. It was number 2 after Black Tom Island. And it was done by one man using a derivative, a variant of the cigar bombs. Because unlike other munitions plants in the country, Kingsland was so big that it had its own security force, had a lot of security safeguards in place, and everyone that came into work got searched. So you weren't going to be able to take in explosive devices. It'd be hard to conceal any sort of fire starting mechanism other than these glasses. They could be disguised. They could be very well hidden. And that, in fact, is how there you go, the Kingsland fire.
And that's right near where the Meadowlands is today.
Yep.
The stadium
Yep, and there's a monument not far away that commemorates this explosion, not far from Jersey City.
So Mike, given that amazingly we don't really know a lot about this, there have not been a lot of books written about the topic until your book. Jim Lattin was reading my mind when he asked, how do you go about researching a subject like this? How did you find the information? I mean, there's not a lot out there, and people aren't aware of it. So, kind of what was? We actually want to pick your brain because we love to know how other historians do their jobs.
Right, we
steal your ideas.
We want to be inspired. Is what Chris is trying to say.
That's right.
Right. So were documents Jim asked that were intended to be destroyed, or people who ended up writing their memoirs, or court cases, or what, or all of the above?
Okay, 2 answers. The first one is the easiest one. All of the documents related to this campaign are actually at the National Archives, the U.S. National Archives. And that includes a lot of the British, Canadian, and German documents, because these were collected by the Mixed Claims Commission, which was suing the German government for millions of dollars. So the attorneys, 5 of them, one of whom worked himself to death at his desk, actually, every document they produced, every decision that was made is on a piece of paper within just several boxes at the U.S. National Archives. But I didn't know about that. Because of my work, I spoke with a couple of my colleagues at the FBI explosives unit back in Washington D.C., and it's part of what I do. And over the years, we got to talking about the World War II sabotage devices, some of which they still had, and I was able to see them. And I just got to talk to them about World War I and the cigar bombs when I started doing my research. And they kind of directed me towards the Library of Congress and the National Archives, which I wouldn't have done on my own, actually. And that's where everything was. Of course, so from the explosives unit, I started reading about Walter Scheel, the cigar bombs. And from there, I took up the explosives unit's suggestion and I went to the National Archives. And that's where it all just, I'm in a room looking at all these boxes thinking, this can't possibly be every document on this case. I mean, this is massive, but it was. It was thrilling, actually.
What's a show?
No,
Mike?
I was not. I was actually testing you there. So, Mike, I wanted to explain to you that the way you're supposed to answer that question is that it was hours, years of toil and research in which you carefully pieced together everything from many multiple sources, and that you were the first to make these discoveries, and you're humble about it, and yet excited about it. So just keep that in mind for the next show that you're on when you're answering that question. But I'll take it. There's another question. We talked about the scale of this campaign a little bit, and somebody asked us about examples. Frank Cook asked us if there are examples of a West Coast or Midwest event that was involved in this sabotage campaign.
Holy boy, West Coast and Midwest. So Seattle Harbor, July of 1915, a huge explosion, nearly a ton of dynamite exploded, done by German agents out of the San Francisco consulate. In my book, there's 3 chapters related to the West Coast operations: the von Bopp conspiracy, the munitions of war conspiracy, and another one as well. Bombings that were to take place in Canada, in the Western United States. I don't mention it in the book, but they were involved in some murders in the Los Angeles San Gabriel Mountains, not far from here. And in the Midwest, there's a fantastic story. I would love to spend an hour just talking about an agent by the name of J. Herbert Cole of the Bureau of Investigation. This guy, that's him right there. What a stud. He single-handedly, despite orders to the contrary, he single-handedly spearheaded the investigations on the Cult Schmidt investigation, which was the Detroit cell. And were it not for the Cult Schmidt incompetence and the fact that J. Herbert Cole was going to unturn everything to uncover the entire conspiracy, he put all these guys in prison, all of them. And I don't think anyone's ever even heard of him before. But J. Herbert Cole deserves just as much credit as any of the, as Lieutenant Tunney in New York, as Agent William Bryan in Seattle. And by the way, Agent Bryan had some of the most colorful notes written in the margins of his reports. None of which could be repeated here on the air. But
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, we people have used every word you can use on this show.
He minced no words in his communiques with his headquarters, with the U.S. Attorney's Office, or even just personal notations of his own. You know exactly what he was feeling as he was writing these reports. It's awesome. I got some of them framed.
Chris, do you have a? I mean, I have a very obvious question that you'd probably ask the same one as we approach the end of the show. What is the ultimate impact of this campaign? I mean, we have a big campaign. We have explosions, sabotage, dozens or hundreds of events, murders, high-ranking people involved. Eventually, the U.S. comes into the war. How do we sum up the impact of this German sabotage campaign?
Sure, it had no effect on the war. Zero. It didn't keep munitions from flowing. It didn't keep horses, despite the fact that hundreds of horses are dying at sea from being poisoned by the German sabotage agents. It had no impact. I mean, there was so many horses, mules, munitions.
And that was like a germ warfare, right? That they were doing, injecting the horses.
It was.
It was incredible.
So in that respect, it had nothing. It didn't impact the war at all. But here in America, it got U.S. law enforcement to start working together. Now, they had worked together over some Union bombings in 1910, but soon enough they decided to go their own merry way. The Robert Fay case and the German sabotage case as a whole really got American law enforcement working together, and it convinced the federal government that the Federal Bureau of Investigation should be mandated to conduct investigations involving terrorism and explosives, which is how it is today. And then thirdly, the Espionage Act of 1917 is a direct result of American government's frustration over having some charges to file against some of these German saboteurs. So when you read when you read the Espionage Act, you can read between the lines. You see exactly what they're talking about. The ability to prosecute Germans and Americans in the United States cooperating with the Germans over this campaign. And by that, they're talking about compromised journalists, but that's for another day.
That's for the next hour we do on this. Mike, we want to thank you so much for joining us today for a really fascinating, interesting, weird story that I knew almost nothing about. So it's so great, right, Chris, to open those horizons.
It's always shocking to me when I read something that just I'd never heard about. I mean, to learn something completely brand spanking new about the First World War, really fascinating.
It's frightening all that we don't know.
Hey, Rick and Chris, we didn't do the toast beforehand. So
yes.
So I wanted to hold this up.
What do you got there? So sorry, Mike.
The Gibeit's beer. And this is for all of my colleagues in harm's way, especially those in Poland and Eastern Europe. So Nastrovia to them.
Thank you so much. Thank you for remembering. Somebody's got to help us out here, and we're pleased that you're doing it. I want to say that Mike Digby is the author of Burn, Bomb, Destroy, the German Sabotage Campaign in North America, 1914 to 1917. Mike, thank you again so much for joining us, and we'll see you around on Sunday afternoons for future guests.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, take care. Oh, whoops, I cut him off there. Sorry I cut you off there, Mike. Yeah, sorry we cut you off. So you can now say thank you. We won't cut you off.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me.
All right, now I'll let you go. Okay. It's that kind of show, folks. And Chris, I want to also thank my friend Roy Eichhorn, who suggested this book and whose great-grandfather was on the, I think great-grandfather, I might be saying that incorrectly, was on the Mixed Claims Commission and has other connections to the story. And we were just together this weekend, and I know he was watching the show, so I wanted to give a shout out to him. And we've got a couple of interesting shows coming up, Chris. One an encore, one a new one. But the first one, next week we have an encore show
with Philippe Sands, which is one of my absolute favorites. Fascinating book about about a whole lot about families and European history and interconnected lives
and Nazis. Don't forget
Nazis. And they all kind of came back to me this week because a lot of it happens in and around Lviv, which is in the news again. So it's a breathtaking book.
Yeah, so that has its Ukraine connection as well. And then in 2 weeks, Chris, we are going to we're going to have a special show from Normandy. Do we know exactly what it's going to be in? What's going to be in it, Chris? I don't think we do yet.
Well, no, we have a bunch of our guests have submitted some real brain teasers about questions about Normandy that we always wanted to ask, but we're afraid to. So we're all going to be sitting around together.
We have
probably
four
with some
historians
wine.
there,
Four historians.
and we're also going to be visiting a lot of sites. So we hope to have some little video production elements from those sites. And so we don't know exactly what form it will take, but it should be interesting and exciting. And it's Normandy.
It's Normandy. It'll involve Calvados. It'll be good.
It'll be great. So we hope you join us for those two shows and forever onward. And if you like what you're seeing here, please do like us on Facebook or subscribe to us on YouTube. We're desperate for the approval, as we've said many times, and it does help us. And see you around.
Be safe, everyone.